This
today's
conference will now be recorded.
Sorry, there we go.
Thanks, Kaylin. Thanks everyone for attending, and I'm really happy to be able to give you some information about business interruption insurance in general and business interruption insurance related to the COVID-19 pandemic. I imagine that most of you are experiencing some level of business income reduction as a result of the pandemic. So, and if you haven't already started a claim, you're probably very interested in knowing how to do that and what kinds of issues you're going to see. So we'll talk about those issues and a little bit about business income or business interruption insurance as it's known both ways in general. So a little bit about me. I'm an attorney. I practice insurance law exclusively. I represent policyholders, mostly businesses, meaning if you have an insurance policy, primarily property casualty, I don't do much in the other lines, then I work with you. Sometimes I work with individuals. I don't represent insurance companies. I do occasionally represent insurance brokers. And I have represented insurance companies in the past. Before I was an attorney, I was a multi-line claims adjuster, and I was the claims manager for a large top 20 insurance brokerage with offices around the United States. So I've been in the insurance business in one way or another since right after I graduated from high school in 1986. And so right now, again, I represent policyholders, and I also do expert witness work on insurance matters because I've done so much of this. I'm an adjunct professor as well at both the University of Denver Sturm College of Law and the University of Colorado School of Law, teaching insurance law. Okay, so today's objectives, what I hope you guys get out of this is the following. And I understand that the slides will be made available to you afterwards, so you can get those and follow up with any questions. But so I'd like you guys to get a general understanding of business income or business interruption insurance. We'll talk about the ways in which COVID-19 has interfered with business income. We'll talk about some of the common coverage issues related to COVID-19 BI claims that are coming up, including a brief discussion of the key Colorado case law and a discussion of where things stand nationwide. Litigation has already started on this, as you can imagine, so we'll talk a little bit about that. Some of the possible legislative solutions that are being discussed right now, and then I'm happy to, if as time allows, entertain any questions that you all have. So let's talk about business interruption or business income insurance in general. Generally, this coverage is associated with a commercial property policy. It's usually an endorsement that you would add on to that policy. So your commercial property policy typically covers your building and your business personal property, your equipment, and the things that you have within your business. And the business income coverage is an endorsement that's added on to that policy to provide for the loss of net income that you have related to a covered cause of loss. And that's really important, is that the business income coverage has to be related to or coming from a cause of loss that's covered under your policy. And even though it's not covered in the slides, let me talk a little bit about what those covered causes of losses look like. Most businesses and most good insurance agents and brokers are going to write commercial property coverage on a quote unquote all risk basis, using what they call the special causes of loss form. And what that form basically says is that it covers all physical damage to covered property unless it's otherwise excluded. in the policy, in the covered causes of loss form. So that's why it's known colloquially as all risk coverage, because it covers all risks unless excluded. But as you can imagine, there's a long list of exclusions, and so it's not truly all risk coverage, even though that's how it's known. Sometimes insurance agents will write this coverage on less than an all risk basis, primarily to save money for businesses that are price sensitive. And so you could have a broad form causes of loss form, or even a basic causes of loss form that doesn't cover much beyond fire. So depending on what kind of coverage you have, you'll have broader or narrower coverage, and the business income coverage is going to be tied to those same causes of loss. So in the insurance world, most commercial property insurance and business income insurance is written using forms that are drafted by what's called the Insurance Services Office, or ISO. And what that is an organization that insurance companies pay into, and they monitor litigation around the country. And every few years, they will revise the quote unquote standard forms that insurance companies often use to write insurance. And so those forms adapt to changing case law and litigation around the country. Insurance companies will sometimes adopt those forms wholesale, and sometimes they'll take them and use them as a basis to customize the form and create their own proprietary forms. But the ISO language is very, very common, and it's very common to see just a straight ISO form on a commercial property policy. And likewise, the business income and extra expense form that's part of the ISO commercial property program is the most common form that you see, and that's the CP 0030 form. And there will be different edition dates of that depending on what your insurance company has decided to use, whether they're using the most current or an older version. That form covers business income and extra expense. And what does that mean? Well, business income is defined in this form as your net income. That's your net profit or loss before taxes. And that's the income that would have been earned or incurred had there not been a loss. So that's an important concept. You're not going to get your gross income. You're going to get your net income in the way that it's defined in the form. Now, as noted, it covers your net profit or loss. So if your business is not profiting at the time of the loss, there's still some coverage under this form. And basically what happens there is you're going to get your continuing operating expenses paid for less the losses that you were experiencing before the incident that caused you to make the claim. So, and that's the other aspect of this form that's really important. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Is anyone else hearing that? Just wanted to make sure that you all can hear me. So continuing normal operating expenses, including payroll. I think this is really important. A few years ago, you might recall in the Denver area, there was a massive hailstorm that hit the western part of Denver and the Lakewood area, and it affected the Colorado Mills Mall, and it blew out, the hail blew out skylights at the mall and flooded the entire mall with rain, and the whole mall had to shut down. And a lot of those businesses laid off their employees. And I remember seeing news stories about this, that they were holding job fairs for all these employees from the mall, and they were otherwise trying to help these employees find work because they got laid off and weren't getting paid. And that was really frustrating to me, because there's no reason why those businesses shouldn't have had business income and extra expense coverage that could have paid those employees their payroll, their normal paychecks, until they were able to come back to work. Because as you all know, it's very expensive to retrain new employees And so it's important to hold on to your workforce if you can. That's why that coverage is there. And I think that's important to know that. The other coverage under this form is the extra expense coverage. And what that is are those extra expenses that you might incur to reduce the business income loss. So for example, let's say you have an engineering firm and your building burns and you have to close those offices for a while. Well, extra expense could cover, for example, renting an alternative office so you can keep working. You're probably not going to work at full capacity, but you're going to earn some income, and that's going to reduce the amount of loss that the insurance company would have to pay. So those extra expenses to reduce the business income loss are sometimes covered. So opening in an alternative location or making arrangements for employees to work at home, those extra expenses can be covered under the form. What's really crucial and what's problematic about this pandemic is the coverage trigger for business income. And again, I'm primarily going to talk about the business income and extra expense form that's part of the ISO commercial property coverage, because that's the most common form of business interruption coverage that's out there. There are some other forms that I'll touch on that are triggered by different things, but most businesses don't have those. So your coverage trigger for business income, and I quoted the language out of the ISO form here, is we, meaning the insurance company, will pay for the actual loss of business income you sustain due to the necessary suspension of your operations during the period of restoration. Okay, so let me stop there because there's a lot going on in that sentence. So the insurance company is going to pay for your actual loss of business income up to the limit. That's covered later, but up to the limits that you sustain due to the necessary suspension of your operation. So again, it's not that the insurance company is going to pay you to close just because it's a precaution that you feel is advisable under a circumstance. No, it has to be something that the insurance company thinks is necessary. You had to either close or reduce your operations because it was necessary to do so. The term suspension is defined in the policy, and it does include a slowdown of operations. It doesn't mean you have to close entirely. But let's just say, for example, that part of your building burns in a fire. You're able to continue working, but you can't operate part of your business because of the damage. You've got a suspension of operations. It's necessary to suspend part of the operation because that part of the building is burned and not safe to occupy. So that gives you a sense of what a typical loss would look like. And then this goes on to say that the suspension must be caused by direct physical loss of or damage to property at the premises described in the declarations, and for which a business income limit of insurance is shown. So you have to actually buy the coverage, and a lot of businesses don't do that because of trying to save premium. But the key that I want to focus on here is the direct physical loss or damage to property at the premises. That is what insurance companies is saying is the sentence that precludes coverage for business income losses due to the pandemic. The insurance industry has made its position absolutely clear from the very start of this pandemic in the United States. In March, the insurance industry started saying in various statements publicly that there would be no business interruption coverage under the commercial property form and the business income coverage that's associated with it because there's no physical loss or damage to covered property. And we'll talk about how that's not, I mean, it sounds kind of basic and kind of most people would sort of, I think, say, yeah, that's true. How was my building damaged by COVID-19? How was my equipment damaged by COVID-19? And so at a sort of gut level, that kind of sounds right. But as you know, when it comes to contracts and insurance and legal issues, lawyers can be creative. And so there's some wiggle room here that I'm going to go into in a little bit. But that's in general what you have to have to trigger your business income or business interruption coverage. So the issues, and I think I kind of covered them already, created by this language, is you have to have a necessary suspension of operations, and that is going to be defined by what you do. And I think that's an important point to make in general. I think we, and including me, as business people, get really busy doing our work, running our businesses, and we don't go back and revisit our insurance policies very often. Operations can change. You can buy new subsidiaries, you can go into new products, new services. And so it's really important to keep your insurance company informed as to what you're doing in your business, because that's the way it's described in your policy. And if they find out when you have a loss that you were doing something other than what you told them you were doing, you went from running a restaurant to making fireworks. I know it's kind of a far-fetched scenario, but these things do happen sometimes, and they're going to be a little bit upset with you that, hey, number one, it's not described in the policy that you were making fireworks, and number two, we probably wouldn't have insured you if we knew that. So it's important to keep your insurance company informed about what your operations actually are as they change over time. As I noted, that this coverage is triggered by direct physical loss of or damage to property at the premises, and you had to have actually purchased business income coverage. If there's not a limit showing there and you didn't pay a premium, you don't have this coverage. And when I was on the insurance broker side of the industry, I was really frustrated to see this happen, where small businesses would, and I understand price pressures and cost issues and so forth, our margins are usually slim, but to not carry the coverage at all and then have your building burned down, and now your income stream, which is one of your most important assets, that stream of income that you rely on to pay your bills and to pay your employees and feed your family, it's a hugely important asset, and it's one that you really should protect. And this is one of the ways that you can protect it. I alluded to this already. You have to have a necessary suspension of your operations. So it's those activities that occur at the premises. And if you're in the real estate rental business, it's the tenantability of your premises. Those are your operations. And the suspension can mean a slowdown or a cessation of your activities. And it can be part or all of the described premises being untenable, again, if your business is renting out properties. Let me touch on the ISO Business Owners Program, or BOP program. So I'll take a step back. I talked about the ISO Commercial Property Program and how the business income and extra expense form is part of that. It's an endorsement that's added onto that. And then oftentimes you combine the commercial property forms, and there are several others that you can add on to cover different things, with the ISO commercial general liability coverage, right? That's your liability coverage, and you put it all together and it's called a package policy. And that's what a lot of businesses have. But that is a very, or at least it can be a very complex package approach to insurance. And it's really geared to be available to businesses of any size, but it fits mostly larger businesses. And to simplify things for smaller businesses, most insurance companies have some form of a BOP program, a business owners program, that instead of having a bunch of different forms that you've got to add on to make this package policy, they kind of look at an industry like a restaurant or construction or oil and gas or whatever industry it is and say, gee, these are the things that most restaurants need. So we're going to put them all together in a program just for that industry, and they're going to have their liability, their property, their business income, all those coverages thrown into one. There's fewer options. You still have some optional coverages to add on, including sometimes business income, but we're just going to make it simpler and more customized for that industry, and it's a BOP form. Most insurance companies don't use the ISO BOP form. Most have drafted their own proprietary forms, and they may rely to some extent on the ISO language, but that is what a lot of businesses have. And essentially, if you've got a bot form, especially if it's using the ISO language, you're going to have the same kinds of issues for business income coverage that you've got under the commercial property and the business income and extra expense form. You're going to have the same languages and generally going to have the same discussions about the coverage triggers and so forth. So like I said, these are often industry-specific forms, and they're going to be focused on the issues those industries face. But sometimes, like I said, they'll use the ISO language. I told you I would talk a little bit about other kinds of business interruption coverages that are out there. And so let's touch on those. One really common one that can be endorsed onto a commercial property policy or a BOP policy is utility service interruption coverage. And the idea with this is if the utility, say Xcel Energy, has property damage to some of its facilities and it results in a utility interruption to your business, such as power being cut off, then you can have coverage under this form for that loss of income that you sustain. Something I didn't touch on with the business income coverage generally, but that's even truer with utility service interruption coverage is there's usually a waiting period before your coverage kicks in. Because the idea is if they had to cover every single little small loss, your insurance would get really expensive, more expensive than it already is. So these coverages often will have a time limit or time frame during which there's no coverage, kind of like a time deductible, if you will. So it's not uncommon to see a 3-day waiting period, for example, and with utility service interruption, that might be a little shorter, but the idea is you got to have an interruption for a certain amount of time. So utility service interruption, it has to be the kind of property that's described in the endorsement schedule. And a lot of insurance companies restrict coverage to damage to utility equipment that's within a certain radius of your business, maybe 1 mile or 5 miles. And the idea is, look, we're not here to cover some major transformer that goes down out in California that affects us out here in Colorado in some way. No, it's more the pole that's outside your business gets taken out and now you don't have power for a couple of days and you got to shut down. That's the kind of loss that's covered there. I'm going to skip down to the bottom on this slide, talking about civil authority coverage. And what that is when a governmental authority prohibits access to your location because of property damage to somebody else's property from a covered cause of loss. Again, it's got to be something that's covered under the policy. Then there's business income coverage for that. And so the typical loss that you would see is, let's say you run a retail store in a strip mall, and a couple doors down, a restaurant catches fire and they have to shut down. The government comes in and says, we're going to shut down the whole strip mall until we inspect and make sure that it's safe for people to be there. And it takes a while because the government is busy. That's where civil authority coverage kicks in. So you've got a covered cause of loss, a fire, which is covered under almost every property policy. You've got the governmental authority prohibiting access to your location because of property damage to another business's property. But a lot of people are feeling like civil authority coverage should be triggered by these pandemic orders that are ordering businesses to close, or at least certain kinds of businesses. And as you can see, unless it's connected to a covered cause of loss, that's not going to be the case. But a lot of people don't understand that. They just think that if a civil authority orders a closure and interrupts their business, it's going to be covered. And I can understand the frustration around finding out that that's not going to be the case. Let me skip back to the one in the middle, contingent business income or business interruption coverage. This is one that's becoming more common as businesses start to look at the way that they are affected by risk and the ways in which their income stream can be threatened. And I'll give you an example when this coverage started to become a little bit more prevalent, at least among bigger businesses. You may remember a few years back, there was a major earthquake in Asia and a tsunami that hit Thailand. And what happened there was there were a lot of businesses in Thailand that were making component parts for the auto industry, for automakers all over the world, in Germany, Japan, and the United States. And when those businesses were shut down because of the tsunami and all the related utility interruption and everything else that was happening related to the earthquake and the tsunami, they obviously couldn't make component parts. And that affected automakers here in the United States and in Europe and in Japan. And so they began to realize that in this global economy where we're all interdependent upon each other, that something that happens to another business that supplies me, my business, or to one of my customers, and they can't buy stuff from me, that can really affect my income stream. If my sole distributor goes down, then I can't get the components that I need, and I can't make my product, or I can't deliver my service. And I had a client that was in kind of this situation as well, where they were the sole supplier for their customer, and they had to shut down. This was down in the Colorado Springs area. They had to shut down due to wildfires a few years ago. They were never actually damaged, but because the government ordered them to shut down and to evacuate, they were concerned that they were going to have a business income loss because their customer would realize they were vulnerable and maybe decide to diversify their supply chain and hire other people to help provide the product that they needed. So it forced them to think about their business income in a different way and to look at contingent business income or business interruption insurance. And that's something I think a lot of companies in this present pandemic situation are starting to do, is to look at the different ways that their income stream can be affected. You can also go, before I go into the next slide really, you can also, there are business income components to a lot of different kinds of policies. Toward the end of the presentation, I'll touch on cyber liability. Sometimes cyber liability can have a business, or cyber coverage can have a business income component. And so same thing can be true with equipment policies. There's one for builder's risk for contractors that are constructing properties, and if something happens to the property under construction or the equipment that's being used to construct it, you can have business income coverage related to that. It's also called soft cost coverage. So business income coverage can be under many different policies. And so when you have a business income loss, something that happens to your business and your income is being affected, I think you have to look across all your policies to try to figure out where the coverage might be, if there is any. Okay, so let's go back to the business income form under the ISO program and the problem with direct physical loss or damage. As I said, the insurance companies and the insurance industry's position has been there's no direct physical loss of or damage to covered property related to the pandemic. Well, here in Colorado, we have one of the leading cases that's being used to challenge that argument. It's this First Presbyterian Church case that was issued by the Colorado Supreme Court in 1968. And that was a church that had to shut down because they had this strange odor that ultimately was resolved when there was a natural gas line repaired. But for a long time, they couldn't identify what this odor was. And the Colorado Supreme Court took this case and ultimately decided that, and I've quoted the key language here, this particular loss of use, because in this case, the property form defined property damage as including loss of use, and this is a common thing with many policies even today. This particular loss of use was simply the consequential result of the fact that because of the accumulation of gasoline around and under the church building, the premises became so infiltrated and saturated as to be uninhabitable, making further use of the building highly dangerous. All of which we hold equates to a direct physical loss within the meaning of that phrase as used by the company in its endorsement, insuring against all other risks. Well, what does that mean here? Well, the idea is that it's possible that a business could become so infected with COVID that it's sitting on equipment or in the walls or even just in the air in the building that there could be an argument that you've got direct physical loss of or damage to covered property. And depending on the language of any particular policy, there could be other sort of creative arguments that policyholder lawyers will be making on behalf of their business clients to trigger coverage for business income losses. Now, assuming you've got a business where you have a lot of people that gather and you've got an argument that you've got enough of the virus in your building that you've got direct physical loss of or damage to your property, or depending on your coverage form, maybe you've got a civil authority argument or something similar, some way to get past this direct physical loss or damage to covered property hurdle. The bad news is you've got more hurdles potentially. For example, every single property policy out there that I've ever seen has some form of pollution exclusion associated with it. And the insurance companies, the way they define pollutant in these policies is so broad that virtually anything could be considered a pollutant under the right circumstances. And so this is another exclusion that insurance companies are going to use and have been using to deny coverage. Also, there are a lot of mold or microbe exclusions that define microbes broadly enough that it could include the pandemic virus. More importantly, many policies have some sort of an endorsement excluding losses related to virus or bacteria. And these endorsements started to get used in 2006 after the SARS outbreak, and insurance companies realizing they might have a vulnerability here to business income losses and other kinds of losses related to that outbreak. And so they began to append a lot of commercial property policies with this exclusionary endorsement related to viruses or bacteria. Now, one question that the attachment of that endorsement raises is if you've got a policy without that endorsement, do you have coverage? In other words, since the insurance industry found it necessary to include an endorsement that prohibited coverage, was it basically saying that the form before provided coverage? Well, that's an argument that's going to be made in those cases where that endorsement isn't attached to a policy. Another argument that is going to be made is if you've had your policy for a long time and you renew it year after year with the same insurance company, and somewhere along the line they add this endorsement, did they properly disclose it to you that they were adding this endorsement, which was potentially restricting coverage? And if they didn't, and they didn't reduce your premium, is the endorsement enforceable? It's a concept that we call regulatory estoppel. And again, it's a complex legal argument, but it's one that might get made in a lot of situations. So what's happening across the country is that businesses in virtually every industry are making claims because they really don't have another choice. A lot of businesses just don't have the capital. They weren't able to get relief under the various programs that are out there right now through the government, or even if they have gotten that relief, it's not enough, and they're still making claims. So basically, any business that has an income loss in any kind of industry, businesses are making claims against these policies. And there are thousands and thousands of these claims across the country, probably millions at this point. I know that there are several thousand at this point lawsuits that have actually been filed over business income losses around the country. And there have been about a half a dozen efforts to establish what we call multi-district litigation, class action litigation in the federal court system. And so there's a lot of jostling among some of the bigger law firms around the country as to who's going to take on those lawsuits. Can they get those class actions certified for multi-district litigation? And so down the road, you may see commercials from large law firms saying, if your business has suffered a loss, you can be part of our class, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of activity happening on this front in the court system. It's not something that's going to get resolved anytime soon. It's going to take years for this litigation to play out. The money, if it ever comes, will be years down the road. But you know, it's the kind of thing that people have to try to do, I think, to stay afloat. And the insurance industry is obviously fighting this very aggressively. Another thing that's happened is that at the federal government level and at the state level, there have been some movements to try to legislate coverage. In other words, go back and say that regardless of what the policy said, there's going to be a statute, whether a federal statute or a state statute, saying that no, the business income coverage was triggered by this pandemic. And this started early on in the pandemic in March, when a group of Congress people sent a letter to insurance industry leaders urging them to extend BI coverage to COVID-19 losses. And I summarize some of the responses here, but suffice it to say that the insurance industry has strongly disagreed with those efforts. They don't believe there's coverage. They think it's inappropriate for any legislative body to create by legislative fiat retroactive coverage for the pandemic losses. And they base their arguments on a few different things. One is the contracts clause of the Constitution that prohibits governmental interference with contracts, except under certain circumstances. Another argument that they make is that they never collected premium for this kind of a worldwide unprecedented risk. And so forcing them to cover these losses without receiving premium is basically going to bankrupt the industry, or at least a lot of insurance companies within the industry. Much in the same way that massive environmental litigation in the 80s and 90s did, and asbestos litigation, which is ongoing even today under historic policies. You know, when I said earlier that almost every insurance policy has a pollution exclusion on it, well, that's why, because they didn't used to have those exclusions. And after the insurance industry got hit with this environmental litigation, they realized they needed to exclude coverage if they were going to stay afloat. You're already starting to see, I mean, as I mentioned, there were already endorsements being added for viruses and bacteria to policies, but you're already starting to see with renewals a pandemic exclusion, taking it one step further to be very specific that any kind of losses related to a pandemic, as defined in the policy, are not going to be covered. And that is a signal that is not good news, because as a lot of scientists have been concerned about, as the climate changes, we could see more pandemics down the road as new mutations of viruses and bacteria come out, and the insurance industry is very concerned about that. And so they foresee potentially some pandemics in the future beyond COVID. Probably the only way to resolve this issue is going to be some sort of public-private solution where the government and the insurance industry and businesses work together. There have been some initial steps that direction, with in Congress, the Pandemic Risk Insurance Act being introduced, kind of similar to the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act that came out of the 9/11 incident. And in that situation, the government funded 95% of the coverage So it was acting as a backstop for the insurance industry, and the insurance industry would administer claims. So you may recall that in your policy, you have an option to either opt in or out of TRIA, the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act. The Pandemic Risk Insurance Act would be something similar to that. Whether or not it's retroactive in effect and covers COVID-19 is going to be a question, but frankly, in this political environment, it seems unlikely that we're going to have a public-private solution anytime soon. So for your business, what should you be thinking about for your business income claim related to COVID-19? Well, as the Division of Insurance here in Colorado has said, there's an FAQ document available on their website that you can go look at. They're saying absolutely you should submit your claim because you don't know if you've got coverage until you submit your claim and let the insurance company take a look at it. However, before you just go run off and call your insurance agent, it's important to frame your claim as carefully as you can to maximize the chances that you're going to get coverage. And so some of the more astute insurance brokers in town are getting good at this. There are coverage attorneys that can help you frame your claim. It's the kind of thing where I think a little bit of forethought can help maximize your chances of getting recovery. But as I noted, there are lots of hurdles. Something else that you need to think about, if you've ever had a business income claim, you know this, that you're going to need an accountant. You're going to need an accountant because the insurance company, if they even entertain your claim, or in any kind of business income claim, such as related to a fire loss or whatever, they are going to have their own forensic accountants challenge your claim. They're going to go through your books over several years. They're going to question what your actual income was, and that's their job. Their job is to reduce the amount they pay in a claim. They're supposed to pay what they owe, but what they owe is usually subject to dispute. So if you have your claim considered by the insurance company, you're going to need your own forensic accountant, not only to help you figure out what your income was, but what it would have been had this whole thing not happened. Here in Colorado, our economy was pretty strong. It was growing. A lot of businesses were growing. So their business income loss wasn't the average that they would have earned over the last 3 years necessarily. Some businesses were seeing massive upticks in their business when this hit. And then that could be true with any kind of business income loss. When a fire takes down your business, you might have been growing at the time. So you need somebody who can help project what your income was going to be, but for the loss. Another issue is that a lot of policyholder attorneys like me are concerned that inexperienced lawyers getting a hold of these cases might make bad law for other businesses. And so we're really trying to push people to make sure if you're going to pursue this kind of a loss that you hire an attorney who really knows business insurance, and that should help everybody. Getting beyond business income and business interruption coverage, there are other kinds of insurance that can be affected or triggered by this pandemic and that you should be thinking about. I noted commercial general liability before. That's your business liability insurance. It's inevitable that you're going to see lawsuits from customers who claim they got COVID-19 at businesses, and they're going to claim that those businesses maybe shouldn't have reopened as quickly as they did or didn't use safety precautions the way that they should have. You're going to see litigation around that, and so those policies could be triggered. Also, as many of you already know, employees and their families coming down with COVID are going to make health insurance claims, and we're seeing all kinds of issues related to that. Workers' compensation coverage, employees that get COVID or at least claim to get COVID on the job, they're making claims, and those kinds of challenges and disputes are rising now. For those of you who have directors and officers liability coverage, the idea that shareholders are challenging decisions that businesses are making related to COVID-19 and how that affects the stock price and the value of the business, we're seeing those kinds of claims already. As well as employment practices liability coverage. If you're carrying this coverage, we expect to see claims coming out of, for example, is there discrimination in the way that employers are making the decision to bring employees back to work? Who's being brought back and why? Who's being let go and why? So we expect to see claims like that. A huge area right now is cyber liability. And I'll get to that in a little bit more detail in a second. But in a nutshell, since more businesses are making it possible for their employees to work at home, where their businesses allow that kind of thing, where their job is amenable to that kind of an arrangement, there's a greater exposure and therefore an uptick in the related claims. And of course, there's going to be a lot of businesses who are going to claim that their insurance agent or broker should have anticipated the need for coverage for a pandemic, or didn't tell them they wouldn't have coverage for business income losses related to a pandemic, and they're going to sue their brokers. So we're going to see a lot of different kinds of claims coming out of this beyond just business income insurance. Let me touch briefly on cyber coverage. So for those of you who have this coverage, you know that there are two basic coverages. One is something that happens with your data, your business, your website, and forces you to go down. You lose your data and you've got to restore it, or you've got to let customers know about a breach of some sort. The other is the liability coverage that comes along with it. If one of your customers or some other third party claims that you were legally liable for some sort of loss they had due to a data breach. So what's happening with cyber coverage, obviously a lot of employees are working at home now, and that creates an additional exposure because of that hardware, if they're using their own laptops or their own mobile phones, might not have the same kinds of protections that you would have if you were if they were working within your facility. And likewise, with connectivity issues and less secure networks and so forth, the chances of a breach have gone up. And sometimes employers are even relaxing their digital hygiene, if you will, their protective measures, just to get things done, because they're trying to serve their customers, and sometimes these different safety and security features slow things down. And so that's creating an increased risk of cyber related claims. And there are some exclusions that could come into play under this pandemic that wouldn't ordinarily. So for example, a lot of cyber policies will only cover you for the infrastructure that you use and control. Now your employees are using a consumer network, or maybe even a shared Wi-Fi with neighbors or whatever, and that's not secure. That might be excluded under your cyber coverage if you've got it. Likewise, to the extent you are shut down by some sort of data breach, most cyber policies only cover a necessary or required shutdown. If you voluntarily shut down some parts of your network to make other parts more effective, that might not be covered. And then also limitations in how the computer system or the network is defined. It might only extend to your owned or operated system, or designated systems operated by third parties. And now again, you're off that and you're onto some other network. That might create a coverage issue. So lots of things to think about. If you haven't already, and you've gone to remote working and you haven't already talked with your insurance agent or broker about how your coverage might respond under those circumstances or need to be amended, then that's a conversation you should probably have right away. So just to kind of wrap it up and open it up to questions, business income claims are really complicated. Even in an ordinary fire situation, they take a long time and a lot of work and special expertise to get through. Sometimes you need a coverage attorney. You will always need an accountant. So be prepared if you make a claim. You're going to have an uphill battle because of all the different issues that we just talked about. Don't be thinking just about your business income coverage. Think about how other coverages might come into play with the pandemic as circumstances are changing. And just keep an eye out and keep pressure on your elected representatives to come up with a long-term solution that's going to help your business. So with all that, I'll open up to any questions, Kaylin, if we have some.
We did have a few. So apart from what Kathy commented earlier, office admin has a few questions, actually a lot. I'll go ahead and read this aloud. Would any of this information change for nonprofits? I'm sure this is based on individual coverage, but is there a certain percentage they usually cover of income loss? What if we have received grants and the PPP loan, excuse me, to cover those loss of income, including payroll already? That funding has run out. Also, we have an open claim right now. I'm trying to wrap up because our office flooded about 2 weeks before the stay-at-home order. So we have not been working in our office since then, and our office just finished getting renovated 2 weeks ago. I'm assuming these claims can't overlap.
So a lot to unpack there. That was all one question there, Kaylin, or?
Yeah, so let's say, so there's like maybe like 5 questions in there. So,
yeah,
so I feel like the general question, would any of this information change for nonprofits?
Yeah, so just let me start with that. So for nonprofits, you can still have business income claims. They're a little different because you're not talking about profits. You're really talking more about continuing operating expenses and some degree of surplus that nonprofits are able to hold. But basically, yes, a nonprofit can have a type of business income policy, and they may have a claim depending on the circumstances. I think the same general obstacles arise for nonprofits as with for-profit companies, but it's something that the nonprofit should look into.
Kathy, I noticed earlier in the session you had you brought up your issue. Do you have a specific question for Damian? I can also unmute you if you would like, so you can ask him directly.
Yes, I was just asking about, we did have business interruption insurance with Lloyd's of London, and they did not honor the claim.
Right.
Even though we completely shut down for 2 months.
Right. And so what you would need to do is really have a lawyer or at least your insurance broker look at the denial letter from Lloyd's to see if there's an argument that could be made to challenge that. But I think it's really common. Again, the entire insurance industry worldwide has taken the position that these claims are not covered. Some of them went so far as to even just put a general denial on their websites early on. They've taken them down since because insurance companies are not supposed to deny coverage until they've actually investigated the individual claim. But yeah, so it's possible that it could be challenged, but I think a lawyer would have to take a look at it and see what the basis for the denial was and see if there was any arguments to be made.
Okay.
Office admin, I know I probably didn't read your message very well. There was a lot to unpack there, but I can go ahead and unmute you if you have a question that you would like to ask Damian verbally.
And I'm looking at the question that was in the comments too.
Yeah, there she is. Yeah.
Yeah, I put my camera on so you're not talking to a blank wall.
Thank you.
Yeah, since you said it's basically the same for nonprofits, I just want to know, with all of our issues that we're dealing with right now, if this is even going to be worth our ROI to look into this further because of the claim that we have open right now and not finished, and the grants that we get. I just don't know if it would even be worth it.
Yeah, it's really complicated, and so it's I don't think there's an across the board answer I can give to everybody, but you know what I think is that most businesses, if they've got the coverage, they should at least make a claim, and when they get the denial, and it's almost inevitable that they will, maybe it's not something that you take action on right away. You generally in Colorado, you got 3 years to make a breach of contract claim and 2 years to make a bad faith claim, meaning if the insurance company denied your coverage in bad faith. So essentially from the date of the denial, you've got 2 years to bring a loss. And so you can wait a little bit and see kind of what develops, talk with an attorney, maybe just do a consult and figure out, okay, do we have a stronger or weaker case? Should we do anything, or should we just kind of watch and see what happens? But I would submit the claim in the first instance just to get the response, because under almost every policy, you've got a duty to promptly notify the insurance company of a claim. Now, it's a kind of a flexible standard under most policies. Some policies are not. Some you might only have 60 days or 180 days to make your claim, but most policies, you've got some time, some flexibility. If you make the claim, then at least you've satisfied your duty. You get the denial, and you can kind of see where it goes. Talk with an attorney, see what your individual circumstance is. If you've got a previous loss, or if you have a subsequent loss, and I'm thinking about all the businesses that were affected by the protests downtown. That they were shut down, they just reopened, and now they've got they got damaged and vandalized during those protests. Now they have a whole other claim. It may or may not be covered, but how do you even figure out which business income, how much of the business income loss was related to the pandemic versus those protests? And it's a mess, and it just gets really complicated to sort that out. And I think if you have that kind of a loss, or if you have any kind of a business income loss now, unrelated to COVID-19, you really do need an accountant to help you try to sort that mess out. And not just any accountant. Like I said, there are forensic accountants whose job is to help not only figure out what your income was, which isn't always the easiest thing to do, but what it would have been, and to use reliable sources of data to figure that out. Yeah.
We do have one question from Nick, and it says, in this presentation, you suggested that contamination of a location by COVID-19 may be an arguable option. Would that not conversely open you to liability from people who may have been exposed?
Yeah, and that's a really good perception there, and that is true. That could possibly have that could be a double-edged sword, right? That could be argued that to create legal liability to someone in the future. I don't think it's an automatic sort of thing. Saying in the first instance that your business had to shut down because you had coronavirus in the building, and you had to decontaminate, disinfect, and so forth, doesn't necessarily mean that if you're sued by a customer later that you're automatically going to be liable. But I think it's a valid point to sort of think of, and that's another reason why I think it's a good idea to consult with an attorney before you make your claim, so that you are kind of running those traps and thinking through your overall situation. I would think most businesses, if you shut down because you were concerned that your business was infected, you've probably done some serious decontamination before you reopened, and that would be an argument in your defense. But no, I think that's a perceptive remark right there.
All right, well, unless anybody else has any last minute questions, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Damian, for presenting all of this very, very valuable information. I know it's a lot, but I'm sure you guys are overwhelmed. But after this session ends, I am going to send an email out with all of Damian's information, the presentation, along with the recording for you all to reference, and I'm sure Damian doesn't mind if you guys reach out afterward with your particular type of case, just because it's just one of those things, you know. But yeah, thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.